Are you kidding me? That's what?
Yeah, every so often it happens that Ryan is right.
100% right. Not even a little bit right.
Tucker Pullman, 2 points last game.
No kidding.
My man!
Hey, neither does me running shirtless, but that turned out very well.
Welcome to the PP1 podcast.
I feel like our intro might have scared off our guest today, but he's probably seen a lot worse. The PP1 podcast on Crier Media is proud to bring onto the show today Scott Rintoul. He of many talents. Anybody that listens to our show, obviously, a lot of Vancouverites. We're talking 1040. We're talking 650. We're talking the fact that he's a dad. He's a podcaster, a runner extraordinaire. Scott Rintoul, welcome to the show.
Ryan, thanks, man. I don't have to go shirtless, but the intro made me think for a second. I'm pretty happy to keep mine on, though.
Tarps off is always optional. We operate on a usually a strictly let's keep our shirts on basis. So you've had a busy few months. It seems, as I can see in my podcast feed every single week. You've recently released Unreal Sports West Coast Express, and we're going to get into that in a second. We've got a few other things to go. It's amazing already. I've tweeted, I've retweeted, it's basically it's like a love letter to Canucks fans. Unfortunately, we all know that there is somewhat of an ending that we all do not prefer, but it's great. First of all, congratulations on that. It's good to see, good to hear your voice, good to see you doing the rounds and doing all that. Go Goat Sports has been great for you as well. It's been great to see you, Scott. I've got a few things that we kind of always go over at the beginning, kind of little, break the ice a little bit with myself and Ted, who's not here. He is recovering from heart surgery. He had now I guess he's a tricuspid aortic valve, or I guess he's got his little throttle body, the Binford, in there now. So he is recovered. He's at home from the hospital. 3 months from now, he'll be slamming dingers for us on our hops ball team. So shout out to you, Ted. I know you'll be listening and watching this likely later because you're probably napping right now. Something about getting your blood levels back up. I get it. It's fine.
Yeah, man, sending positive vibes his way.
He's not the kind of guy that would soak this in and be selfish about it, but we'll be selfish for him. I'm very happy that this life-changing thing happened for him, and he'll be better for it. I'm a little bit scared of how well he'll be on the baseball field, knowing that he'll have more blood pumping through his body. So we'll see. Some weird car stuff today, Scott. You're in the Lower Mainland, so you see a lot of cars, a lot of different things down there. Kelowna's no stranger to that. 3 things I've seen in the last day, and I'm thrilled because these are things I can talk about. First one, I saw a car yesterday with the license plate BLK SUV. You're thinking, okay, big deal. Great. Who cares? It was a silver Chrysler 200. Black. I'm just, maybe let's deke out on the license plate thing. I mean, I get it, but do you want to keep that vanity plate if you've already got, a new car? Like, what's the call on that?
Well, maybe it's just trying to speak it into existence. Maybe the black SUV is something that this owner has never had, and putting it out there into the world will one day materialize into the black SUV.
It's like one of those pin boards, like a Pinterest board, but in real life that you've spent probably more money than you'd like to. And Chrysler 200 isn't bad. It's just, it's not a black SUV.
No, it's not.
The other one I saw, and this was super weird, and I'm sure you've seen this too. I've been a struggling student to make money, and had my little beater car. So sometimes your sound system growing up, going through your late teens and your maybe early 20s, heck, 30s or 40s possibly, and we don't all have a great sound system. Sometimes we don't even have one. I'm sure you've seen the person with like headphones in their vehicle, right? Like, it's not out of the ordinary. It's not the safest thing to do based on safety things and making sure you can hear emergency vehicles. And I thought, okay, whatever. He looked like a younger kid. Here's the thing. The vehicle he was driving, I know, has a decent sound system. It was a Porsche Cayenne, like easily newer model. So it's not that he couldn't listen to his music in the vehicle. He made a choice there.
Okay, so maybe it's quite the opposite. Maybe what you thought were headphones were actually those noise canceling headphones that I put on my kids when we'd go to sporting events when they were really little. So maybe it's that the sound system is too good, and now he's got the noise canceling headphones on to protect his ears.
Do you think maybe he could just turn down the volume? I mean,
He could, but again,
that
maybe
seems
he's
like
got
the easy
kids.
fix.
Maybe his passengers demand that he blares the music. I have no idea.
I think he was the only one in the vehicle. That's why I was a little confused. So, and then finally today, I was getting my massage, get my muscles back in to where they need to be, which I'm going to feel like a wreck for the next 2 days because Kaylee, you're awesome at Move Health and Wellness. Thank you for destroying me. I'll be back to good by Saturday or so. I saw this in the parking lot. It was like a late 90s, early 2000s pickup truck, no grill, but instead of a grill, because you don't want stuff coming through, your radiator, all that. It was a Bush Light, cardboard box that he clearly dismantled and attached it. So, Kelowna, way to go. Way to go. We don't need terrible parking Facebook groups. Sometimes just enjoy the scenery for what it is.
Hey, man,
Kinda-
maybe that's just like the fly your flag. I am such a fan of Bud Light.
You do
I'll show
you.
you how much of a fan I am. I will
Yeah.
take out the grill on my vehicle and show you what I drink each and every day, week, month, who knows?
I mean, it was at the Walmart parking lot, so you start figuring some things out from there. So, I mean, I'm there, but I felt that my car was fine. To the task at hand, West Coast Express, huge hit. This is what everybody's been asking for. I feel you delivered. I think it's going to deliver long term. This has staying power. Once all the episodes come out, like any good Netflix show or any TV series, I do feel this is going to be one of those that stands the test of time. I mean, as I said at the beginning, you've done an amazing job, and we're not even done yet. How many episodes are total in the whole series?
There will be 9 episodes in the whole series. And yeah, as you mentioned, as you and I are having this recording right now, episode 7 is coming out tomorrow as it stands. So yeah, we're almost at episode 7, which is certainly a big one if you've listened to the first 6 episodes in the series. Episode 6 is 2002, 2003, which means episode 7 contains the infamous incident.
And it's fitting. I don't know if you were able to time how all these released. I'm sure you did because you're very clever. This is I always get it's the 8th or the 9th that happened. It was March 8th.
March 8th, 2004 when it happened. And actually, I would have preferred to have it further removed from the actual date because I did not want this podcast whatsoever to be sensational because of that.
Right.
I wanted it to be sensational because of the content and because their story overall, in my opinion, is fantastic. Like, it's an incredible story for so many different reasons that you and I can get into here over the next little while. But when I was putting this together, I was cognizant of the fact that some people were going to want to use that as the hook, make that the sensational part of it. And I didn't want that to be the case. And I didn't feel, honestly, if I was asking Brendan Morrison, Todd Bertuzzi, and Marcus Naslund to participate in this, that it was of service to them if I went that way. And I don't think they would have done it if they thought that's the way I was going to take this either.
Yeah, I think the neat thing about the whole West Coast Express is that there are so many events that happen to lead up to it. Obviously, after we know the Todd Bertuzzi incident's coming up this week. There's a lot of stuff that happens after as well. Like, there's so many of these huge events every time, like every episode I listen, I'm like, oh, right. Where were they brought up that they choked? That was a huge deal. That was a huge deal for everybody because we all just couldn't believe our ears. Did he just say the one thing that you would never expect an athlete to say, let alone the captain, let alone in a market that was red hot? And we're thinking, okay, that's it. I can't believe this happened. And you're talking about it for weeks. It was fodder for radio, for newspapers. I mean, podcasts weren't happening yet, but it was a big deal. I mean, I know it would have been when you guys would have been on the radio. That's all any of us were talking about.
You're absolutely right. And that, to me, what you mentioned, the number of memorable events or unforgettable, in the case of Bertuzzi, more incidents or happenings along the way with this group, that's why this story is so good. Like, if I just gave you on the surface the backstory of, okay, these are 3 players, 2 of them drafted in the first round, another early in the second, who don't really work out with their original organizations, They get traded for by 3 different general managers
Yeah.
and somehow wind up on the same line, even though that was never really the plan when they were brought in, and they become the most dominant line in the NHL. That in itself is a great story. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. Hey, you can do something with that. But then you couple it with all of these memorable events that happen along the way, including each and every playoff series. You know, they get swept in 4 games by the Colorado Avalanche the first time they make it back to the playoffs in 5 years. But Marcus Naslund has this moment that nobody will ever forget, even though he's not playing in the series because he's got a broken leg. And then there's will ever forget the year they lose to the Minnesota Wild, but beat the St. Louis Blues. Both of those are 3-1 comeback series. Then there's the Calgary Flames epic that comes their way after the Bertuzzi Moore incident. Like it's almost unbelievable, except that we lived it and we know it all happened.
Yeah, every one of those years had its own storyline. And going through, like Ted and I, we were both working Jersey City back in the day. So, I mean, for us, we're living it in a different way. We're living it on the sales side, on the merchandise side. And as these names become popular and the T-shirts and the hockey stick logo had just kind of resurfaced around that time as well. So we're starting to sell those things. And like everything was just going absolutely mad for the Canucks. But it was a different storyline each year. And then obviously leading up, the prior years to getting to that point, like the whole buildup, I think, was just as impressive as them actually making it. And I think, again, that's why this is done so well. And I think after it's all said and done, after all the episodes are released, this is one of those things where it will stand on its own. Like it's almost like a little series. Like we don't do DVD box sets anymore, but it kind of has that character to it, I think, that can continue to last. So let's get into some other stuff on here. I think a big question, a lot of us guys that do podcasting and all this background work, you invested a lot of time into this project. How much time did you actually put into this?
I have no idea how many hours. Like,
Your wife will know.
honestly,
Maybe we should ask her.
yeah, it's probably a bad idea for me to put the hours together because it has been a labor of love. And to be perfectly frank, assembling a lot of the elements of this podcast, I was doing other things. So by virtue of that, I was never able to dedicate myself until the last few months specifically to this because I took a year where I was trying a bunch of different stuff. And this was one of those things, but I knew I had a little bit of time to play with because I hadn't put a promise out of when this was coming. Very few people knew about it along the way. So it wasn't until I actually delivered that tweet 3 or 4. Give us a date. Let us know when it's coming. I have no idea how many hours it took me, Ryan, but I feel like it was worth it with everything that I was able to bring together for this.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think anybody's going to say it isn't worth it. I mean, I caught up. I probably started it late, so I think I had 3 episodes to go right off the hop. So for me, it was binge listen as I'm driving around for my work, and I'm thinking, oh, great, like my week's set. I'm going to be jacked every time I hear something new, and it just kept going. The one question I kind of had, because I think a few people were probably thinking this, was this like when you were talking to the Sedins or Morrison or Naslund, any of the coaches, were these like, did you have kind of the whole layout and you'd spend like a 2-hour conversation with each one of these guys? Was it multiple phone calls? How did the setup kind of go?
For the most part, they're singular interviews. There have been a couple of things that you'll hear in the last 2 episodes where I had to call Marcus and Todd and Brendan again just to flush a couple of things out. The other is Trevor Linden, where I asked him a couple of different things about the lockout just because he was the NHL PA president at the time. And I don't spend too much time going into the weeds on the lockout, but it was still an important part of this era and did change things dramatically for this team along the way. But most of them were singular interviews. It's a good question about whether I had it all mapped out because when I started this project, I didn't. When I looked at it originally, I thought, okay, they have a great story. I'll tell that story over the span that they were together, and we'll leave it at that. But as I started to go down the road of talking to them and realizing what they meant to the franchise and ultimately to the city as well, I realized that people who didn't live through it personally weren't going to understand that impact unless they knew what it was like beforehand. So that's why the early episodes are spent talking about what it was like after 94 through to 98, 99, where things weren't very good. They weren't bad in 95, 96, but then they went downhill in a hurry from a results standpoint. And this is a team that had a brand new building at the time. And this is a team that had superstars at the time, the types of players who are supposed to put people in seats. So I wanted to take listeners through the journey of here's how it got to where it got to. And now here's the group that ends up dragging it back very unexpectedly, because Naslund, Bertuzzi, Morrison were not heralded in the way that they ended up being heralded when they first got to the Canucks organization.
Yeah, I mean, Marcus Naslund was kind of climbing up, and we're thinking, okay, like things are going well. We're starting to see something there. Todd Bertuzzi comes over in the trade. Think, okay, like just like any other trade, like you kind of know the name, but you don't really know the player. And then everything just slowly comes together, and next thing you know, we've got the hottest line in hockey. And I mean, it was popular for obviously more reasons than one. I want to get into the Minnesota series. I think a lot of people remember that a few ways. Obviously, there's the fact that they were on the brink of going to the West Coast final, or the Western final, sorry, against Anaheim. And a lot of us believe that that was a series the Canucks probably could have taken. That being said, they didn't. There was a few things that happened where maybe they just got in their own heads, which I think is probably very true. And they've kind of admitted some of those things. But I remember this would have been early Twitter days, so probably like 2012, 2013. And I think I want to say it was like Blake Price or something, or I'd called into, I mean, it might have even been you. And I brought up, I'm trying to remember what it was, saying like, well, you know, they had the opportunity to beat Minnesota and they didn't. And then everyone keeps bringing back how they just got shut down for that whole series, whether it was Willie Mitchell or Wes Walls, or I mean, Darby Hendrickson puts that goal in. And then they're in game 7. Game 7, we're thinking, we've seen this too. I mean, as a Canucks fan, we've heard this story way too many times. Oh, they're up 2-0. I mean, Bertuzzi, I think it was a breakaway goal that they went up on 2-0. And this is it. This is our run. This is the best team we've ever had. Let's just get this over with. Let's go on and let's go and win the Stanley Cup this year. Well, we all know that didn't happen. How do you remember that? Not necessarily as obviously what did happen, but like you personally, how do you remember that series going?
I remember that game 7 specifically as a collapse. So if we want to start there, I remember that game as a collapse. But I, like you, and I was covering it at the time, I was in the building for all of those games in Vancouver, including game 7. I, like you, thought they've got this series. They won the first game in dramatic fashion. Minnesota battles back to tie it, but then they go into Minnesota, and despite the fact they barely got any shots in game 3, but that power play was such a weapon at the time. It was so good, and they were opportunistic on the power play in games 3 and 4. So they come back up 3-1, and literally it just felt like a matter of time. They laid an egg in game 5, but you thought, okay, whatever, everybody has an off night. They go back to Minnesota, and they didn't play badly, but Minnesota played really well. And yet there was still this collective confidence coming back for game 7 because people had recently seen it. They'd seen them beat St. Louis in game 7 the round before, after coming back from their own 3-1 series deficit. They'd been a great home team all year. They're playing against a Minnesota team that really was in gravy time. Hey, this is awesome. We upset the Colorado Avalanche. We're taking the Canucks to game 7. But there was such a confidence, and that confidence was well warranted through almost the first 2 periods. As you mentioned, they're up 2-0 and completely dominating that game. It's not just that they had the lead, they were dominating that game. As Mark Crawford says, and this isn't a spoiler alert, but as Mark Crawford says in that episode, they didn't have a scoring chance, Minnesota, through almost 2 periods of play. And the goal that gets Minnesota back in is one of those fluky goals. Now, the Canucks have benefited from some of those in their history, the Kevin Bieksa stanchion goal being one of them. But it was such a fluky goal where the puck comes back over the net, bounces in front, and then it's past Kluche, who hasn't even seen the puck at the time. Like, you can't fault anybody on that play. It's just one of those weird things in sports that happens. But they were up 2-1 still, going into the 3rd period at home with a shot at the Western Conference Final on the line. There was still a collective confidence, and it evaporated. And that's why I say it was a collapse. All of a sudden, it was 2-2, and everybody in the building got a little nervous. That team started to play not to lose because they knew they were the heavy favorite. They all of a sudden, it was almost as if they felt the stakes of, guys, we had this thing in the bag, and we're supposed to go to the third round, maybe the Stanley Cup. Don't blow this. That's what it felt like in the building at the time. And we all know how it ends, and Minnesota goes on to the next round. But that's how I remember that series.
It's funny how these kind of series don't quite foreshadow the future. I mean, Boston is a great example of 3-2. As much as we wanted to believe 3-2 meant they were a win away, we all said to, our collective heads, like, they couldn't lose 2 games against Boston. No way. We've shut
Do you
them
remember?
out twice.
Sorry to jump in, Ryan, but do you remember when they were up 2-0 in the Stanley Cup final, and people in Vancouver, and I was doing the radio show at the time, Ferraro and I were doing the morning show, and we took calls from people and we got texts from people saying, I hope they lose 1 game in Boston because I want to see them win it at home. Not, I think they're going to finally win a Stanley Cup. People were so convinced. And I know we're deviating.
They
from
want
the
it
series
tailored.
I've done, but they were so convinced. And there was a similar feeling with that Minnesota series. Okay, the Canucks are going to win it. It's just a matter of when. And
it felt like it.
Yeah, it really
It
did.
did feel like it. Yeah, it's 2 series. I mean, I guess San Jose and Vegas know that story a little bit differently too. That 5-minute major seems to stick out for some reason.
Well, there's a lot of teams that know that. Hey, you mentioned the Boston Bruins. Boston blew a 3-0 series lead. The year before they ultimately beat Vancouver in the Stanley Cup. They blew a 3-0 series lead to the Philadelphia Flyers the year before that. So there's been tons of teams that have had their own collapses. I know Vancouver fans don't think it happens to anybody but them, but it does.
Yeah, it's I think we have a little bit of recency bias every time. Well, it's only been us. It's no one ever has. Of course it does. Like I think as the Canucks fan base, we seem to, and this is stating the obvious, we all think like everything matters to this organization. Everything matters. This is the only fan base that's going through any of this. And yet you go over to the Eastern Conference and you see like, yeah, shut it down in Pittsburgh. It's over. And like, what are you talking about? And all the stuff. Yeah, they got to fire the coach. They got to get rid of the GM, get rid of Hextall. And we're crying because, we're not content with a retool or whatever that needs to look like. We're just so whiny about what we believe we deserve. And yet there's 31 other teams that are going through equally painful things. I mean, what about the fact that you don't have a Shea Weber to be on your team anymore, or a Carey Price, or, down the road. And we still believe like, wow, it should be about the Canucks. And now as soon as they start talking about the Canucks in the national media, we need to stop talking about the Canucks. Well, what do we want? What are we here? So
it's negativity bias. It really is. And you find it in every fan base. Right? Because if you were looking at you referenced the Montreal Canadiens not having a Shea Weber or a Carey Price anymore. And if you're a Canucks fan looking at that, or another fan base looking at Montreal, you go, yeah, but you just went to the Stanley Cup final and you went on this immaculate run and it was so much fun and the entire country for the most part got on board. Like you have that. And then there's others who would look at, the Toronto Maple Leafs, for example. Like you can make a pretty good case that the Leafs are living their West Coast Express era right now. An era where you have dominant offensive players. And for the most part, in the early going of this Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner era, John Tavares included, they were super fun to watch. They've locked it down. Happened. They haven't been able to get anything done in the playoffs, even though they have individual awards, even though they have these great players that people have gravitated to and love watching. Like the Vancouver Canucks of the era I've documented, they didn't get anything done in the postseason, and they're kind of at that put up or shut up point this year. Feel like that for you, that if the Leafs don't finally get absolutely, at minimum a series win, that there will be massive changes to that organization?
I think we're all waiting for that pin to drop. And I mean, as a Canucks fan, that would be awful if the Leafs won. At the same time, as a Canadian hockey fan, and you take away all the rivalries and everything, you're right. You look at that team, you think they better get it done, because that they're going to have to change it, because you can't keep running that same team, that same formula, and expect that, next year maybe we'll get a shot. And of course, they're going to go and play Tampa Bay in the first round. Maybe they'll luck out somehow and get someone else. But it's like Vancouver goes through Chicago, or they go through, they kept playing St. Louis for the longest time too. But it's almost like they need to get over their personal, their dragon of whatever that looks like, to get past that point. And just like the Canucks, it was If they get past the second round, because they've had a fairly short history, it was either they're out or they go to the Cup. There's no middle. They've never just lost in the Western Conference Final, which is kind of bizarre if you think about the teams that have been in Vancouver. So we don't know anything else. It's either they make the playoffs or they don't, or they go all the way and lose. So there's some massive extremes for this fan base, whereas, we could see the Leafs going a lot further. We can see, I mean, you look at a Calgary or at Edmonton, like Edmonton was a few years ago, where it looked like they were going to go to the Stanley Cup the next year, and then they're back in, top three. So it's a funny sport, I think, Scott, and I think we all need to chill out a little bit. The one thing
it shows you how fine the margins are, Ryan. Sorry to jump in on you.
No, that's okay.
You look at that West Coast Express era, for example, and I think the Leafs are a good tie into this as well, because you can tell yourself you're this close, but you just played the wrong team. The Canucks lose that first playoff series back in 2001 to the Avalanche. Well, they go win the Stanley Cup.
Mhm.
Well, we lost to the eventual Cup champs. Same with the Detroit Red Wings the next year. The collapse against Minnesota is a little bit different, but then the following year, and again, this isn't spoiling the podcast, you guys all know this happened, but they lose to the Calgary Flames. And what do the Flames do? They go to the Stanley Cup final that same year and narrowly lose to the Tampa Bay Lightning. It makes you feel you're a lot closer than you actually are.
Yeah, that Calgary series, I think, even if the Canucks would have won that series, somehow, there's no way they were going to get that far. They just weren't built the way to. I don't believe they were. They made it. I mean, Bertuzzi's obviously out at that point. They didn't have all their horses. They still got to. I mean, they didn't have Kluche as well, and Alex All, the famous play against Marty Jelna. I mean, even had they gone through to that next round, I mean, the Canucks are probably going to be ripe for the picking anyway. So
maybe, but it's a funny thing.
But
that's why the Stanley Cup playoffs are such a funny thing. Did anybody have Dallas going all the way the year of the bubble, getting there and ultimately losing to Tampa Bay?
True.
The year where the Canucks missed the playoffs in 05-06, the first year after the lockout, Edmonton's the team that gets into the playoffs because the Canucks don't finally get there. And what do the Oilers do? They go to the Stanley Cup final, Game 7, but every time they won a round, people went, okay, this is over now. Like, it's done now. They had their nice moment in the sun. You just never know in the playoffs because weird things happen.
So this is the weird thing. And this was probably, to me, I think the Messier episode stood out the most. And I think it still will after this is all said and done. Because hearing from all the players and we've heard bits and pieces over the years about Mark Messier in the dressing room. But did it surprise you how revered he actually was, and the fact that they brought the team kind of together, and where they were probably a lot closer than anybody was willing to, I guess, admit, or because a lot of you guys, I'm like, you've been in a lot of dressing rooms or for the Canucks anyway, and you've seen this happen. But I mean, Mark Messier it felt like the worst possible thing for obvious reasons after they lose, and yet we're hearing from all the players, oh, he taught me this, and he was such a great teammate, and this and that, and he wanted to win, and that's why it was like, did that surprise you as well? The fact that you're hearing like these words that just made no sense almost?
It's not that it surprised me that much from a couple of players. Like, I knew Marcus Naslund, having taken over the captaincy and heard him speak about it before. I knew Marcus Naslund felt he got a lot from Mark Messier on the leadership front and that he taught him a lot. Bertuzzi, I wasn't sure, but because I knew he was an Oilers fan growing up, I figured he probably revered Messier to a certain degree. But you're right. Everybody talks about Mark Messier in very glowing terms, except for the group that was there when he first arrived, that was the old guard from 94. And it's not that they disparaged Messier as a person or even a player to that extent. Like, they didn't. Dave Babbage, for example, has a couple of very memorable quotes in that episode. But Babbage is the first to say, it didn't ever bother me about Messier as a player or a person. It just bothered me that once Keenan got there, they were kind of their own separate entity from the team. But that was a Mike Keenan who was trying to turn that roster over, and he was going to build around a guy he'd already won a Stanley Cup with in New York. Some of the stories surprised me, though, Ryan. Like the story Mark Crawford tells, and I'm not going to ruin it for those who haven't had a chance to listen to that episode, about Messier's final game as a Canuck. that story to me was fantastic. Brian Burke waxes poetic to a certain degree about Messier. Dave Nonis as well. He really did have a better impact on the players who remained than Canucks fans want to give him credit for. And you don't have to change your opinion about Mark Messier, but getting a new perspective on it might make you see what he did in Vancouver in a slightly different light.
It it just felt so weird listening to it and just thinking that was the first thing after I listened to that. I know you and I have been kind of chatting in the background for a few weeks, and I thought as soon as I heard that episode, I said, okay, I had a bunch of questions kind of planned out for you, and then they all kind of changed. I thought I need to go in a different way because my brain had just exploded from hearing all this, and it was weird to hear as a Canucks fan, weird to hear that from the whole 94 thing that happened and they lose. Then he comes over and we just all have this image and this feeling about Messier and Keenan. And then you kind of hear it back and think, okay, I can still have my opinion on it, but at the same time, I'm thinking, well, these guys were, fans of him and great teammates. Over time, we mature, we grow up, we we can change our minds a little bit, and I think we can still hate Mark Messier for the obvious reasons, but I do think that we probably deserve to be fair to the team that we've cherished in this West Coast Express era, and probably think, you know what? And I've said this before, if we didn't have the Messier era, we don't get all these other things. We don't get Roberto Luongo. We don't get Todd Bertuzzi. We don't get all these extra awesome things. We don't get a 2011 run because, it's the Kevin Bacon effect kind of thing. All those things trickle to the next thing, the kind of this serendipitous kind of butterfly effect thing. We needed that to happen, whether we want to. And right now, maybe we need this awful time of whatever this is called in the current Canucks regime. Maybe we do need this because there's something, 6-7 years down the road where we're going to think, well, I'm glad we went through that, even though it didn't feel good at the time.
You make a very good point. And remember John Tortorella and the 1 year he spent here, what did he say at the end?
Mm-hmm.
It's stale. Like, this needs to change. And he
Mm-hmm.
wasn't wrong. And here's a very unpopular take. You don't have to change your opinion on the person, but Mike Keenan had the right idea. Like, Mike Keenan's idea of having to turn over the roster, and that perhaps the Canucks as an organization had been a little too loyal to players who are revered in their history, that they'd been loyal for a little too long. He wasn't wrong on that. They did need to turn part of that roster over. The problem was he was the one person that couldn't do it because of his relationship with the fan base dating back to 1994. Whatever he did wasn't going to sell to Canucks fans. If that's a different person coming in and trying that idea, maybe it goes over a little bit better than it did at the time. Ultimately, though Keenan didn't carry out all of the moves, ultimately that strategy is what that team needed to do, ultimately did, and built itself back up. But he was just the wrong guy for the job because of that relationship.
Well, they're the two flagship guys, right? I mean, it was one thing to have a Mike Keenan and then Mark Messier. You think, okay, that's enough. We're good. Are we going to get Brian Leach too? Who else do we want to bring over? Like it's the kind of thing you would write in like a, in a superhero kind of movie. And like, of course the villains are going to take over. And
or in a dramatic docu-series that you are putting together.
Yeah, there's no way that happened, and yet it did happen. We're almost done here, Scott. I know you got to get some time to get to your kids. A couple final questions here. The big question, this is my personal question, is there going to be a sequel? Are we going to see a docu-series on the Sedins? Are we going to see one on the road up to 2011? Alex Burrows, maybe Rory Fitzpatrick. Is there something in the works that you could tease to say, don't give up yet? There's a little bit more coming down the road.
How about a solid maybe? How about that?
That's good enough for me.
Ryan, here's what I'll tell you. The whole concept behind Unreal, which is what we've entitled the franchise, is that this was going to be season 1. Okay. However, and whether this disappoints you or not, maybe it excites you. Unreal is supposed to be about more than just hockey. It's supposed to be about more than just Vancouver. It's supposed to be about unreal stories. And there are a lot of them across sports. So what I can tell you is that I have plans to do a second season and beyond. I'm not going to say that it's going to be Vancouver Canucks centric, because right now, if push came to shove, it wouldn't be. It would actually be different sport, different story. But what I can tell you is I will find something that I believe is compelling in a different way, but equally compelling to be a part of this franchise for season number 2.
I love it. So if it's the Vancouver Grizzlies, we get it. I think that's quite a story. I mean, it keeps it close to home. I'm sure you've got enough contacts that you can make that happen. The final one, I went through a little deep dive of your Instagram. You also have a golden retriever.
I do.
And it's Leia. Is that correct? Or
It is.
now I've also got a golden retriever. His name's Rocket. He turned 4 today. Happy birthday, Rocket! Upstairs.
Happy birthday, Rocket.
He doesn't. Unfortunately, I found out he doesn't care, and I'm trying to tell that to my wife and kids, because he's like, oh, it's his birthday. He's a dog. You give him a cookie, he's thrilled. So I'm sure you know this already, but how jealous and how ridiculous is Leia? Because I know what I see every day, and I know that's very similar for a lot of other retriever families. So, like, what's a day to day in your house with a dog?
Oh, she's the best. Like, she is the best. I absolutely love dogs. My kids love her. It's their real first dog. We did have a golden retriever a number of years ago, but unfortunately, she passed before my kids got to an age where they knew anything about her. So this is their first dog, and bringing home that puppy, you know this, Ryan, like,
Mhm.
it's such a memorable moment and heartwarming moment. My little girls had no idea. We surprised them when we brought her home just over a year ago, and
Yeah.
literally my oldest opened the door and I was holding this puppy, and she just kind of lost it. She was shocked, overwhelmed, all of those things all at once. Yeah, it's a great day-to-day existence. There's such great family dogs. We've had a blast with her, not without, the odd incident here and there of eating a
Mhm.
pair of socks or whatever it happens to be along the way.
Mhm.
Because as you
Mhm.
know, they like food. They're motivated by
Mhm.
people and food, but it's a fun
Mhm.
problem to have. We absolutely love her.
So cheese obviously is a commodity thing in your house, and because you have a girl dog, and we're getting now to the point where everybody's starting to get their lawns ready for the spring. How does your lawn look right now? Because
Well,
mine
here's
looks
the good
awesome.
news. Here's the good news. I have trained her in the first year to, for the most part, go somewhere that's not on the lawn. So she's pretty good with it. She's pretty
Love it.
good with it. Now, sometimes when the
Excellent.
kids take her out and she's running the show a little more than when dad takes the dog out, she gets the odd bit of lawn. But for the most part, she's pretty good about it. I'll say that. And you mentioned the cheese. Yeah, cheese is a big commodity for
Mhm.
her. But man, she's a counter surfer if she can be, and we've learned the hard way about that. One morning, my wife made a banana bread, fabulous. Had it for breakfast. There's half the loaf sitting on the counter. Didn't
Mhm.
even think about it. Came
Mhm.
back down from getting the kids ready upstairs to get off to school, and
Mhm.
I thought my wife must have wrapped it up, must have put it away somewhere. Nope. Dog got up and ate half a loaf of banana bread, not a crumb to be found. Probably one of the
That's
greatest days of her life to this point.
that's a fun aftermath, I'm sure, because
Oh
I've
yeah.
been, yeah,
Yeah,
I've been there.
because if your house is anything like mine, you're
Mhm.
picking up 95 to 98% of the crap, right, Ryan?
Then sure, yeah, right. I
Oh,
I
your
tend
wife's
to get
having to
home
do
a
it?
little bit later, so sometimes there was a run where I was in charge of that, yes, but
Okay, well,
now that I'm
you got a
home
better
second,
deal than me. I need your
mhm,
agent because I don't have that deal right now in my house.
it's it's an interesting concept. I hear about it, and usually the guilt alone is it's just as bad as having to pick it up. Scott Rintoul, thank you so much for coming by the PB1 podcast today. I hope we can have you on again when Ted's back and properly healthy. I'm sure there's gonna be a lot more to talk about. Maybe we'll have a better Canucks team to chat about. Congratulations on making this thing happen. It's a stunning success. It's amazing. Everybody needs to listen to this on Unreal Sports. Go check it out on after you're done listening to us, obviously. Go check it out on your Apples, on your Spotify's, Google, wherever you can get a podcast. It's so amazing. I can't wait. This week is going to be quite a monumental episode as well. It holds its own, whether any of the other episodes don't already. Go listen to it. West Coast Express. Scott Rintoul, thank you so much.
Hey, Ryan, thanks for having me, man. This was a fun conversation. Keep in touch, and I'm really happy to hear that you're enjoying the podcast.
It's a great. On behalf of Scott Rintoul and Ryan, this PP1 podcast.